The cry that broke the silence. Jack Riddell had seen many strange things in his years as a space trader, but nothing like this. He had docked his ship in the bustling intergalactic market, a place filled with merchants from every corner of the galaxy, selling everything from rare minerals to strange artifacts. The air was thick with the sounds of bargaining and the hum of various alien languages. Yet, among all the noise, Jack heard something different. It was faint at first, almost a whisper, barely noticeable. But then it came again, the soft, heart-wrenching cry. The sound cut through the noise of the market like a blade, a cry full of pain and fear. Jack's head snapped to the side, looking for the source. His eyes scanned the crowd, but no one else seemed to notice. He felt a strange pull in his chest. Something in him told him that cry was meant for him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he had to find it, like he was the only one who could hear it. His feet moved almost on their own, taking him down narrow corridors between the market stalls. The cry grew louder, more desperate, as if someone, or something, was pleading for help. He turned a corner, and there, in the shadows, he saw it. A cage. At first glance, it looked like any other cage used to hold rare and dangerous creatures for sale. But as Jack's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw what was inside. It wasn't a creature at all. It was a girl. She looked human, but not quite. Her skin was a pale, almost silver gray, and her long hair shimmered with a strange, iridescent glow. Her eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Jack's. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away. The noise of the market, the crowd, everything vanished. All that existed in that moment was Jack and the girl in the cage. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her body trembled, and she raised her hand weakly, as if begging for help. Jack's heart raced. He couldn't explain why, but he knew she wasn't just some alien for sale. She wasn't a weapon, nor a mere slave. There was something more to her, a depth in her eyes that spoke of an untold story. The cage was small, barely big enough for her to sit comfortably, and she looked malnourished, weak, and exhausted. Jack took a step forward, but just as he did, a voice from behind him made him freeze. "Don't bother. You can't help her." Jack turned sharply to find a grinning merchant standing just behind him. The man was tall, with blue skin and dark, cold eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. "She's cursed," the merchant continued, his voice low and cruel. "That thing in there. She's the last of her kind. We've tried everything. Medicine, technology, even magic. But she can't be fixed. She's a weapon, and she's dangerous. No one buys her, and no one helps her. It's better this way." The merchant's words felt wrong. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself as much as Jack. Jack didn't reply. His gaze never left the girl in the cage. She looked back at him, her eyes filled with silent desperation. In that moment, Jack knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away. But before he could speak, the merchant chuckled darkly. "You're wasting your time. You think you can just take her? There's a reason she's locked up. No one dares to free her. Trust me, you'll regret it." Jack stepped forward again, his mind made up. He wasn't going to leave her here. Not like this. The merchant's smile faltered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. With a press of a button, a lock on the cage clicked open. "Fine. If you want to waste your credits on a worthless alien girl, then go ahead. But don't say I didn't warn you." The door creaked open, and Jack carefully stepped inside, his eyes never leaving the girl. She didn't move at first, still looking at him with those wide, fearful eyes. Then, slowly, she stood. Her body swayed as if she had trouble balancing, and Jack reached out a hand to steady her. She flinched, but then her hand found his, and she gripped it with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered in a voice barely audible. Her words were soft, but they cut through Jack like a sharp knife. "I'm going to get you out of here," Jack said, his voice steady but full of resolve. She nodded faintly, but Jack could see the fear in her eyes. Are you the last one?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, her expression darkening. "Danger," she murmured. "They will come. For both of us." Jack's stomach tightened. "Who will come?" he asked. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Someone was coming. Jack turned and quickly ushered the girl out of the cage, urging her to follow him. The market, filled with strange alien traders and travelers, was not a safe place for either of them. Whatever danger was waiting for them, Jack had no idea, but he knew one thing for sure. The girl wasn't cursed. She was being hunted. And now so was he. The forbidden purchase. As Jack and the alien girl, Era, slipped away from the cage, the market around them seemed to grow louder, more chaotic. The murmur of voices, the clinking of metal, and the strange sounds of alien creatures all blurred into a distant hum. Jack's pulse raced. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the merchant or guards pursuing them. But there was no one. Yet. Era was still gripping his hand tightly, her fingers cold and trembling. She was looking up at him, her wide, silvery eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and something else. Hope. It made Jack's chest tighten, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. Where can we go?" Jack asked, his voice low. Era opened her mouth as if to speak but hesitated. Her gaze flickered nervously toward the bustling market, then back at Jack. I don't know," she whispered, her voice shaky. "They will come for me. They always come." Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Who will come?" She shook her head, her hair shimmering in the dim light. "I cannot say. They are too powerful." Jack glanced around, trying to stay calm. The market was filled with traders, travelers, and beings from every corner of the galaxy. But something about this place made him feel like an outsider, as if the rules of this world weren't meant for him. And now, with Era beside him, those rules didn't seem to matter anymore. A soft, clicking sound echoed through the hallway they were walking down. Jack tensed. He had been so focused on getting away that he hadn't noticed the shadows shifting behind them. There was someone, or something, following them. He pulled Era to a nearby alley, hoping to hide until the danger passed. But just as they reached the corner, a loud voice boomed through the silence. "Stop right there." Jack froze. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The merchant. The one who had sold Era like she was nothing more than property. Era stiffened beside him, her eyes wide in terror. "They're here. They're coming." Jack didn't have time to think. Instinctively, he grabbed Era's hand and pulled her deeper into the shadows. The alley they entered was narrow, the walls barely wide enough to fit both of them. He could hear the footsteps of the merchant and his guards growing louder, echoing down the corridor. But Jack wasn't about to let them catch him. He had no idea where they were going, no plan, no backup. All he had was the feeling that, somehow, helping Era was the right thing to do. Era's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to hide. I can help." Before Jack could ask how, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, her body trembling with the effort. The air around them seemed to shift, as if the world itself was bending. Suddenly, the shadows deepened, and Jack felt a strange, heavy pressure in the air, like a storm was about to break. Then, silence. The merchant's voice called out from the far end of the alley, but it sounded distant, muffled, like the world was pressing in on itself. Jack turned to see Era, her face pale and strained, but her eyes alight with a faint, otherworldly glow. "What did you do?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Era began, but she faltered, clearly exhausted. "I made us invisible, but it won't last long." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was far beyond anything he had expected. This girl was no ordinary alien. She had powers, dangerous powers, and Jack had just become part of something much bigger than a simple trade deal. The footsteps grew quieter, then stopped altogether. Jack held his breath, trying not to make a sound. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, Jack dared to believe they were safe. But then, the unmistakable sound of a low growl filled the air, something deep and guttural, coming from the dark shadows ahead of them. "Run," Era gasped. Without thinking, Jack grabbed Era's hand and pulled her forward, running faster than he ever had in his life. The air around them was thick with tension, every corner of the alleyway filled with dangers they couldn't yet see. And then, as if on cue, a low voice echoed from the shadows. "You can't hide forever." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar. It was the merchant. But now, it was laced with an edge of something darker. As Jack turned a corner, Era stumbled beside him, breathing heavily. Her powers were clearly taking a toll on her. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I didn't want to put you in danger," Era replied, her voice strained. "But now, it's too late. They know we're together, and they'll stop at nothing to take me back." Jack's mind raced. He had no plan, no idea how to escape, but one thing was clear. He had made a decision, and there was no turning back. He would not let them take her, no matter who was coming for them. "Hold on," Jack said, his grip tightening on her hand. "I'm not going to let them hurt you." Era looked up at him, a flicker of something in her eyes. For the first time since they had met, she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. But Jack could feel it, the pressure building in the air. The hunt had begun. The truth about her curse. Jack's ship was nothing special, just a standard cargo freighter, the kind of vessel a trader like him would use to shuttle goods between planets. It wasn't fast or fancy, but it got the job done. As Jack worked quickly to set the ship's systems to leave the station, Era sat silently in the corner, her pale face reflecting the dim glow of the control panels. He hadn't asked her much about herself yet. There was no time for that. But now, as they soared through the void of space, with the market and the danger left far behind, Jack couldn't ignore the questions swirling in his mind. What was Era? What was she really running from? And what did she mean by "they'll come for me"? The ship hummed with the quiet sounds of engines, but the tension between them was palpable. Jack glanced over at her, still looking fragile, but somehow stronger since they'd escaped. The faint glow of her eyes, something so otherworldly, was haunting, and yet it drew him in. "You said they'd come," Jack finally said, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. "Who are they? And why do you say you're cursed?" Era's eyes flickered to him, then quickly looked away, as though she couldn't bear to meet his gaze for too long. She didn't answer right away, but Jack wasn't about to give up. "I'm not going to leave you hanging, Era," Jack said softly. "If you don't tell me, I won't be able to help you. I need to know what's going on. I need to understand." Era swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. The fear in her eyes was overwhelming, but something else, something darker, flickered in them. Jack could see she was fighting herself, as if the truth itself was a weight too heavy to carry. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They call me the last of the Lurani," she said, her words laced with an ancient sadness. "My people are, a peaceful race. We lived on a planet far from here, hidden in the corners of the galaxy, untouched by the rest of the universe. But we were different. We had abilities." Jack's brow furrowed. "Abilities?" Era nodded slowly. "Not like the kinds of powers you may know. Ours were tied to the stars themselves, connected to the very fabric of space and time. We could sense energy, bend light, move through space without ever leaving the spot we stood in. But we never used it for harm. We believed in balance." Jack shifted in his seat, trying to keep up with her story. "So what happened? Why are you the last one?" The others didn't understand, Era said, her voice breaking slightly. Our powers were dangerous. We couldn't hide them forever. The galaxy's factions, the ones in power, began to see us as a threat. They came for us. They destroyed our world, hunted us down. One by one, they wiped out every last Lyrani. Except me. Jack's mind raced. A single survivor from an entire species. It sounded impossible. He had heard rumors of species wiped out, but he never thought it would be anything like this. And the mention of dangerous powers made it all the more chilling. "Why didn't you fight back?" Jack asked quietly, his voice betraying his disbelief. Era's eyes hardened, but there was a deep sadness in them. "We tried. We fought as best as we could. But our people were pacifists. We never wanted war. We wanted to be left alone. They didn't just want to destroy us. They wanted to use our abilities. For war, for power. And when they couldn't control us, they decided to erase us from existence." Jack was silent, taking it all in. It was hard to imagine that a whole race of beings, with powers like the ones Era described, could be wiped out so easily. He had heard of ruthless empires, but this was something else. The galaxy had a dark side, one that few ever truly saw. "But you're still here," Jack said, his voice steady. "You're alive. And that's why they're after you, isn't it?" Jack was silent, taking it all in. It was hard to imagine that a whole race of beings, with powers like the ones Era described, could be wiped out so easily. He had heard of ruthless empires, but this was something else. The galaxy had a dark side, one that few ever truly saw. "But you're still here," Jack said, his voice steady. "You're alive. And that's why they're after you, isn't it?" Era nodded, her gaze flickering with both fear and defiance. "Yes. I'm the last of my kind. But they didn't just want to kill us, Jack. They wanted to control us. They thought they could force me to use my powers for them. But I escaped. I've been running for so long." Jack's heart sank as he realized the depth of the situation. Era wasn't just running from those who had destroyed her people. She was also running from herself, from the very powers that made her a target. Jack didn't know how to fix that, but he knew one thing. Era wasn't just a survivor, she was a weapon. And the universe wasn't ready for that kind of power. "You said you couldn't control your abilities before," Jack said carefully. "Does that mean they're dangerous?" Era looked away, a faint shudder passing through her. "Yes," she admitted. "I can feel it. The energy. It's alive inside me. It doesn't obey me. It's too much for me to handle. And when I lose control..." Her voice trailed off, and she didn't need to finish the sentence. Jack could see the terror in her eyes. The door to the cockpit slid open, and Jack stiffened, his hand reaching for the controls. "You're not safe here," Era whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her own fears. "Not from me, and not from them." Jack paused, looking at her with a mix of confusion and concern. What did she mean? Was there something more inside her, something she wasn't telling him? But before he could ask, the ship's systems suddenly flickered. The hum of the engines faltered, and the warning lights blinked red. Something was wrong. He quickly glanced at the star map. A series of ships had appeared on his radar, moving fast and coming straight for them. "They found us," Era whispered, her voice barely audible, yet filled with fear. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just the power-hungry factions anymore. Whoever had sent those ships, they weren't just coming to capture Era. They were coming to destroy everything in their path. The hunt had begun. The enemy within. The ship jolted, throwing Jack against the controls as the lights flickered. His heart raced as he struggled to regain control, hands gripping the panels as they blinked in distress. "Damn it," he muttered, slamming his fist against the control board. The ship's engines sputtered, failing to respond to his commands. He turned sharply to look at Era, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "They've hacked into the ship," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. They've taken control. Jack's stomach dropped. His hands flew across the console, trying to override the system, but nothing worked. The ship's systems had been hijacked, and it was no longer responding to him. It was as if the very ship itself had turned against them. But who could be behind it? He turned to Era, eyes frantic. How could they do this? We're still in open space. No one should be able to access us out here. Era's hands trembled as she clasped them tightly in front of her. It's not just any ship, Jack. It's their technology. They've embedded themselves in every system we have. And they've linked it to me. Jack felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. Linked to you. She nodded slowly, her eyes heavy with guilt. When they first started hunting us, they put something in us. A device, a fail-safe, a way to track us, to control us. It was supposed to be a last resort, but if they can access the ship's systems, they can use it to control me too. Jack felt his breath catch in his throat. You're telling me they can control you like a puppet? Era's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, they can force me to use my powers however they want. And if they want, they can make me destroy everything, including you. The words hung in the air, suffocating Jack. For a moment, he couldn't think, couldn't breathe. He had been so focused on protecting Era, so sure that helping her would be the right thing to do. But now, it seemed he had walked straight into a trap. And the trap was much more complicated and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. I didn't want this, Era choked out. I didn't ask for this, but they won't stop until they have me back, Jack. They don't care about the destruction they cause. They don't care about the lives they ruin. And they'll use me to destroy everything. Jack's mind raced, trying to process the situation. He had always been resourceful, always able to think on his feet. But this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. A weapon in the form of a girl, her powers out of control, her enemies able to manipulate her at will. And now, they were controlling the very ship he was flying in. What do we do? Jack asked, his voice tight with frustration. Era's gaze shifted to the console in front of them. There's only one way to stop it. You have to destroy the device that's linked to me. If you don't, it'll control me until it kills us both. Jack's mind churned with the possibilities. Destroy the device. But where was it? How could he even find it? They were in the middle of space, with no time to search through every system. And even if he found it, could he really destroy something so deeply embedded in her? How? Jack asked, his eyes locked on her. How can I destroy something like that? Era's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I can help, but it's dangerous. If I try to access the device, I might lose control of everything. Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't like the sound of that. But if they didn't act now, they'd be dead before they could figure out what to do. I'll take the risk, Jack said, his voice firm. I'm not letting them turn you into their weapon. Era looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and gratitude. You still want to help me, even after everything. I didn't ask for any of this, Jack said, his voice tight. But I'm not giving up on you. Not now. Era nodded slowly, her fingers trembling as she touched a hidden panel on the ship's dashboard. The lights around them flickered again, and Jack could feel the strange pull of energy in the air. Era's body began to shimmer with a faint, glowing light, just as it had when she made them invisible before. Jack felt his pulse quicken as he realized what was happening. Wait. Era. No. But it was too late. Era's powers surged, filling the cockpit with a crackling energy that made the air feel thick and oppressive. The ship groaned as if it were alive, and Jack felt an overwhelming pressure build up around them. The devices, the wires, and the tech systems surrounding them started to spark and snap. The warning lights flashed red again. This time, it wasn't just the ship's systems acting on their own. It was Era, fighting the force inside her that was trying to take control. Jack's hand shot out to her, grabbing her wrist. Era, Focus. We can't afford to. But before he could finish, the ship lurched violently, throwing them both against the walls. The entire vessel shook with the force of something unseen, as if some invisible hand was grabbing them, squeezing the life out of them. And then, Era screamed. The sound was piercing, filled with pain, with anguish, like it was coming from the deepest corners of her soul. Jack's chest tightened, his heart racing. He tried to reach for her, but the power was overwhelming, pushing him back as if the ship itself was fighting against them. Era, he shouted, trying to break through the chaos, but she was no longer in control. The system had fully taken over, and Era's powers were now its weapon. A mind in chains. Jack's head spun as the ship continued to tremble violently. Every panel around him blinked erratically, and the walls hummed with a high-pitched whine that made his teeth ache. He could barely hear over the chaos, but there was one thing that cut through the noise: the sound of Era's screams. It wasn't the kind of scream that anyone would make out of fear. No, this was different. This was raw pain. Her powers were spiraling out of control, and the ship, his ship, was buckling under the weight of the energy that was pouring out of her. Era, Jack yelled, his voice thick with desperation. You have to fight it. Focus on me. He tried to move closer to her, but an invisible force slammed into him, sending him crashing into the cockpit door. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the anguish written on Era's face. She was fighting something inside herself, and Jack could see it. An internal battle so fierce that it was physically manifesting in waves of energy. Her whole body shimmered with a faint, crackling light, and for a moment, her eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity. I can't stop it, she cried, her voice a broken whisper amidst the chaos. I'm not strong enough. I'm not me anymore. They've changed me, turned me into a weapon. Jack scrambled to his feet, his mind racing for a solution, anything to break this nightmare. The ship groaned, shifting erratically in space, as if it were caught in a storm. The control panel sparked, and the entire hull trembled. But there was something else, something Jack hadn't noticed before, a subtle hum beneath the destruction. It was coming from Era, from her powers, but it wasn't quite like the energy he had felt before. It was deeper, darker, a whisper of something that wasn't just in her, it was part of her. Era, Jack said softly, trying to steady his breath. You're not just a weapon. You're more than this. You're not what they made you. I know you. Her eyes snapped toward him, a mixture of confusion and fear flashing in them. You don't understand. I've lost control. I've become the thing they wanted me to be. Jack shook his head, taking a step closer despite the force trying to push him away. No, you're Era, the girl I saved. I don't care about their plans, their control. I care about you. Era's face twisted in agony, but there was something else there now, something flickering in the depths of her gaze. She was fighting it. She was fighting them. For a moment, the raw energy around her began to calm, just a little. But then the hum grew louder, the ship's systems pulsing in sync with the dark energy. Suddenly, Jack understood. Era, the device. It's linked to your mind, isn't it? It's controlling your thoughts, your will. That's what's making you do this. Era gasped, her body jerking as if in response to the realization. Her breathing became more erratic, and she clutched her head, her fingers digging into her scalp. It's not just controlling my powers, she whispered hoarsely. It's controlling me. My thoughts. Every moment they've put in me, every command they gave. It's still there. It's inside me. Jack's heart clenched as he realized the full extent of the nightmare she had been living. It wasn't just about the powers or the control over the ship. The device, the chains they had wrapped around her mind, it was breaking her, piece by piece. You're not just a prisoner of your powers, Jack said urgently. You're a prisoner of your own mind. Era's eyes flickered with a moment of clarity. I am. The ship groaned again, the control systems malfunctioning wildly. Jack glanced at the readouts on the console. The ship was heading straight toward a massive asteroid field. If they didn't regain control soon, they would be pulverized in seconds. But Jack didn't care about that right now. He had to save her. "Era, I need you to focus," Jack said, voice unwavering. "We can get through this together. You've been through worse, right? You've survived the destruction of your home. You've survived their pursuit. You're stronger than they think." Era's gaze softened, her eyes searching his face for something, anything, that would reassure her. But the power inside her continued to pulse, violently threatening to tear her apart. "I'm not strong enough," she whispered, barely audible over the noise. "I'll never be free. They're always inside me, always controlling me." Jack refused to give up. He had to make her see the truth. He had to make her realize that she wasn't their weapon. She was a person, a survivor. And if she believed in that, if she believed in herself, she could break their control. "Era," Jack said, voice calm but firm, "you are stronger than this. You are not just a tool. You're a person. You have a choice. And that's the one thing they can't take from you." For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick with the weight of his words. And then, a flicker, a spark of recognition. Era's eyes widened, her fingers twitching as the light around her flickered. The hum of power dimmed slightly, just enough to give Jack hope. "I can choose?" Era asked, her voice trembling but filled with a new quiet strength. "Yes," Jack said, his heart racing with determination. "You've always had a choice. They made you feel like you didn't, but you do. You can break free from their control." The ship shook violently again, and Jack knew they didn't have much time. The asteroid field was growing closer, and their ship was falling apart. But this was the moment. The moment that Era had to believe in herself. Era closed her eyes, her body trembling, but there was a flicker of determination in her expression. For the first time, she seemed to be fighting with a sense of purpose. She wasn't fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for herself. And Jack, despite the terror of the situation, knew she was about to do something incredible. The shattered chains. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a battlefield. The asteroid field loomed ahead, a chaotic storm of floating rocks and debris that threatened to tear the ship apart at any second. But for Jack, the real battle wasn't out there. It was right here, in the heart of the ship, in the heart of Era. The glow around her intensified, pulsing erratically as she fought the control, the whispers in her mind urging her to unleash her powers. The hum of energy became deafening, vibrating through the walls like a living, breathing thing. Jack knew that if she lost control now, they wouldn't just be destroyed. They'd be obliterated. "Era," Jack shouted, grabbing her by the shoulders. She was trembling, her face contorted with the pain of the battle inside her. "You're stronger than this. You can control it. Fight back." She looked at him, eyes wide with fear, but there was something new in them now, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just terror. It was a spark of something else. Hope. Resolve. "I don't know if I can," Era whispered, her voice breaking. "The power. It's too much. I've tried to hold it back for so long. I'm afraid of what'll happen if I let go." "You won't be alone," Jack said urgently. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." But even as he said the words, the ship groaned beneath them, the control panels flickering wildly. The asteroid field was closing in. Time was running out. They needed to act fast. Jack gripped the console, trying to pull the ship into a steady course, but the systems were too damaged from the constant surges of energy. The ship veered dangerously toward a massive asteroid, and he cursed under his breath. "Era," Jack turned back to her, his voice desperate. "You have to let go. Trust yourself. You can stop this. You can break their hold." For a long moment, Era didn't respond. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her hands trembling as they hovered near her chest, as if she were holding herself together. The ship shook violently again, and Jack braced himself against the sudden jolt. The asteroid field was too close. There wasn't enough time to evade it. But then, a change. Era's body went still. The air around her crackled, her skin glowing brighter, the energy shifting as if she were drawing strength from somewhere deep within herself. Jack couldn't tell what was happening, but he could feel it. A shift in the air, a pull that tugged at his very core. Suddenly, the ship lurched in the opposite direction, veering away from the asteroid with a swift, impossible maneuver. Jack's heart raced as he looked at the controls. It was like the ship had come alive, responding to Era's will. Era. What? Jack started, his voice filled with awe and fear. But Era's eyes remained closed, her face tight with concentration. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But there was power behind it now. The force that had once been chaotic and uncontrolled was beginning to settle into something solid, something more focused. The ship soared through the asteroid field, dodging massive rocks with ease, as though Era had become one with the ship itself. The entire vessel seemed to hum in unison with her, responding to every thought, every movement of her will. It was as if the power that had once threatened to consume them had now become a part of her, a part she was learning to command. "I can feel it," Era whispered, her voice growing steadier. "It's mine now. I can control it. I've always had control. I was too afraid to see it." Jack's breath caught in his chest. This was no longer the broken, frightened girl he had met in that dark corner of the galaxy. This was someone else entirely, someone powerful, someone who had taken back what was hers. The ship barreled through the asteroid field, and for the first time since their escape, Jack felt a sense of hope. But just as he allowed himself to breathe, the alarms blared once more, shattering the moment of peace. "They're here," Era said, her voice cold now, her eyes snapping open. They were no longer filled with fear, but with something else, a burning determination. "They followed us." The radar was alive with blips, and Jack's heart dropped as a fleet of ships appeared on the horizon. They were closing in fast, too fast for them to outrun. But Era wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. "They think they can control me," she said, her voice steady. "But they're wrong. I'm done running. It's time they learned the truth." Jack could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just ready to fight. She was ready to win. And as the enemy ships descended, her hands lifted, glowing with that same otherworldly energy that had nearly destroyed them before. But now, it wasn't chaos. It was precision, power, purpose. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he knew one thing for sure. Era was no longer their prisoner. She was free. And she was going to make them regret ever thinking they could control her. The last stand. The enemy ships surrounded them, a dark swarm in the blackness of space. Jack gripped the console with white-knuckled hands, his pulse hammering in his chest. The odds were stacked against them. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and their ship, though miraculously still holding together, was barely functional. But in that moment, Jack knew one thing. They had Era. The once timid girl who had been a prisoner to her own powers was gone. In her place stood a warrior, a force of nature. Era stood tall, her hands crackling with energy, her eyes locked on the enemy fleet ahead. She was no longer running. She wasn't hiding. She was ready to face them head-on. "They won't stop until they have me back," Era said, her voice cold but determined. "But they're not getting me. Not now. Not ever." Jack turned to her, a fierce grin spreading across his face. "Then let's make sure they don't get anything. I'm with you, Era. Let's end this." Era's gaze shifted to the enemy fleet, and for a moment, Jack could see the weight of her past in her eyes. The fear, the torment, the control they had over her. But now, all of that was fading. The fear was gone. The chains that had bound her, shattered. With a sharp breath, she raised her hands. The air around her vibrated, and the ship hummed in unison with her energy. The controls, which had once felt like a burden, now seemed to pulse with life, responding to her every command. "They're going to regret underestimating us," Era said, her voice steady and resolute. Before Jack could even respond, the enemy ships launched their first volley of fire. The explosion of light was blinding, but Era's hands moved with impossible speed. A force field flared to life around their ship, deflecting the incoming blasts with ease. The enemy had expected a weak, panicked response. They'd been wrong. The ship lurched forward, and Jack could feel Era's power pushing them into a sudden, evasive maneuver, sending them spiraling through space, narrowly dodging asteroid-sized debris. The enemy followed, relentless in their pursuit, but Era was faster. Every twist and turn of their ship was a blur of controlled chaos. "They're not going to stop," Jack shouted over the sound of alarms blaring. "They'll just keep coming." Era's smile was cold, fierce. "Good. Let them." She slammed her hands down onto the console, and Jack felt the ship roar to life. The once shaky systems now hummed with the full power of Era's will. The ship surged forward, faster than it had ever moved before, as Era cut through the enemy fleet with terrifying precision. Laser blasts streaked through space, narrowly missing them as Era twisted their ship into impossible maneuvers, always staying one step ahead. But she wasn't just dodging. With each flick of her wrist, she sent blasts of energy into the heart of the enemy ships, disintegrating their weapons and breaking apart their shields. Jack was awestruck. He had seen her fight, seen her power, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just survival. This was retribution. And then, as the enemy fleet began to close in on them, Era's eyes glowed with an intensity Jack had never seen before. She extended her arms, and a massive shockwave of energy rippled out from their ship. It collided with the first enemy vessel, splitting it in two with a violent explosion. The shockwave continued, sweeping through the fleet, sending ships spiraling out of control, breaking apart under the force of her power. One ship after another fell, helpless in the face of her wrath. They tried to retaliate, launching everything they had, but it was useless. Era had become an unstoppable force. The last of the enemy ships attempted to flee, but Era's eyes locked onto it, her expression cold, unyielding. She raised her hand, and the ship, its engines barely functional, was ripped from space, its metal groaning under the pressure of her grip. With a single, devastating pulse of energy, she shattered it into nothingness. The battle was over. The enemy was no more. Era collapsed into the pilot's seat, her body shaking with the aftershocks of the power she had unleashed. But her face was serene, a peaceful expression replacing the intense concentration she had worn throughout the fight. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the battle. "You did it. You really did it." Era's eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion taking over, but she smiled faintly. "We did it. Together." Jack looked around, taking in the aftermath of the battle. The debris of the destroyed enemy fleet floated in the silence of space. They had won. Against impossible odds, they had emerged victorious. But more than that, they had freed Era. No longer a prisoner, no longer a weapon. She was free. And as the stars stretched out before them, Jack knew that their journey was far from over. But for the first time, it felt like the future was in their hands. Their destiny was theirs to shape. Together.